in starting, I'd like to sort of think about two things in my inspiration for organizing this day. The first one has to do with memory, and the second one has to do with legacy. I think of memory not just because we're going to sort of visit and explore the many, many clinical contributions that Dr. Havens made to many of us personally, but also to the field. But I love thinking in terms of mythological sort of creatures and contexts and gods and goddesses. And of course, we have to think about the goddess memory to start today, because as most of you know, memory had 9 children. And those 9 children, of course, were the muses. And my hope for today is that we can sort of take these memories that we all have of Dr. Havens that are in the books and in the videos and sort of bring them to life in our own work and bring them forward in creative ways that each one of us individually will find to connect with the work and to make it our own. So that's why I think memory is such an important element of today. And legacy, because legacy in the older definitions of the word really referred to ambassadors and emissaries. And I think of Dr. Havens as truly an ambassador who is perhaps needed today more than ever, not just because of the way the field has in many ways narrowed and really focused on not just evidence-based treatments and techniques, but also I think maybe we've lost, many of us have lost at least, the sense of really who the patient is. And to me, Dr. Havens, one of his many gifts was really to connect with the patient. Didn't really matter what the theory was. It didn't really matter what the technique was as much as who the patient was and who you were as a clinician. And he really helped us, those of us who had the experience of being supervised with him or you got to see him speak or do an interview, he really helped us understand how to use our own experience in translating that into the work and to really bringing it to life. So today it's really about memory and legacy and moving forward to today's world. And in that mind, I just happened to call out a sentence from his book, A Safe Space, which I thought would be an appropriate thing to evoke at the beginning here. He says, "The chief obligation of elders remains to make what has been learned interesting enough so it is not neglected by the next generation." So with that in mind, I'd like to invite Dr. Alex Sabo up to start us off.
Well, it's an honor to be here with Susan, Jennifer, rest of Les's family, all of you who've worked with him, and those of you who are new to him. I'm very pleased one of my residents who now teaches at Columbia is here at Christian. So moving on to another generation, and she teaches some of Les's work. And she came up from New York City today. So in that spirit, we're here. And I'd be curious to start with and just ask, how many people who worked with Les or knew Les? I'm trying to get a sense of how familiar, yeah. And then how many people are new to Les's work and just kind of curious and want to kind of get more of a feel? Okay, so I just want to get a sense of my remarks and assumptions. And I was one of the residents who trained with him. So many residents, medical students over many generations trained with Les, and he had a way of connecting with each of us in a pretty unique way, that he'd find the person in us as well as the sort of person who's going to become a psychiatrist or a therapist, and so we all have this kind of very deep personal connection to him, and it's quite lovely. And I want to try to share a little bit of how that works, and particularly in an age, we're in the age of so-called evidence-based medicine or evidence-based psychiatry, and when we work from an evidence base, there are a couple assumptions that are always kind of, or not quite explained. And one of the assumptions is even if you had a really good study that somehow fit the condition of the person you were treating at that moment. And there are not too many, actually, in any part of medicine. For instance, 5% of people who get treated for asthma are the only ones who could go into an evidence-based, randomized, controlled trial. So that 95% of the practice of the treatment of asthma is not evidence-based, but everybody says it is. So there's that issue. But even more important than that issue is the second one, that if you have a great study and you have 1,000 people in it, and 600 respond in a favorable way, and 200 don't in one direction, and another 200 don't in the other. So you have the bell-shaped curve. You're always, as a clinician, working with one person, and you have no idea whatsoever where they fit in that bell curve. So it's always about the relationship. And if anything, more than anything about Les, is he taught us how to form therapeutic relationships, and he tells us, and then you have to survive collision. Okay, that was the message. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But he did that better than anyone I've ever met. And thanks to Susan and Alyssa and Simon and others who've worked so hard on the teaching website, you can go and explore that in a beautiful teaching site whenever you want. And to kind of get in the right space for this presentation today, for the last couple weeks in my residency seminar, we have PGY1 and 2 residents and medical students from BU, UMass Medical School, and the University of New England College of Osteopathic Medicine, and they study with us. And every week, for 2 years for the residents, we do interviewing. So we have a very dedicated group of interviewers, and it's sort of a celebration of the tradition Les has given us at Cambridge Hospital and the others he's taught. But we play with interviewing. Sometimes the older faculty demonstrate, sometimes the medical students do. We go and see patients. We study videos off this website and others. And so it's a tradition of getting close to where the work's done. And that's what I kind of want to bring across today. So, and I want to thank Bob and Susan and Jennifer and everybody, because just what you guys did was awesome in making this occasion today here. And I thank all of you for taking the time on a Saturday morning to show up. But we're going to have some fun. So these are the kind of things that I thought of. I just, when I think about Les, tall, strong, handsome, funny, Harvard professor with patches on the sleeves, and maybe I'll tell you that story. Incredibly well-read, exceptionally intelligent, both an integrative thinker. So you think of the right brain sort of making you part of all that is and getting an intuitive sense of the whole. He had that, but he also had a left brain like none other. It was like Spockian, just so clear, precise, logical. And he could shift back and forth from intuition to that kind of scientific clarity. And it would make you laugh to see. I was laughing almost all the time I was with him, studying with him in the years when I was a resident and later working on projects with him. But he was one of the funniest people, and I had so much fun playing with that mind of his and the way it created an ambient field that was just like, wow, this is cool. It was really, I loved it. So he's an elegant writer. He used to try to get me, he said, would you please do this? I never did it, but he'd tell me about how Addison and Steele, these great essayists of the neoclassical age in British literary history, and Benjamin Franklin, he said, here's what you've got to do. And he did it. He said, when he was trying to become a writer, would read a Franklin essay or an Addison or a Steele, and then he would maybe jot down 3 main ideas, where it began, the middle, and the end. And then he'd say, wait 2 weeks. And then 2 weeks later, he'd write the article himself or the argument of the essay. And then he would go back and play with his heroes and sort of see, did I get it right? Did I do it better? Did they do it better than I? So he had this ability. He was imaginative, and the characters out of history became living buddies in his mind. So that when he and I spoke, or he and a patient were speaking, he had all these friends who were right there with him. Nietzsche, he might be with a psychotic patient, so a patient who was experiencing a psychosis, and almost no one could reach the person, and yet he'd be bringing in Cezanne, and he'd be bringing in Nietzsche, and they would all be in the room together playing. It was just beautiful, and that was something about him. What I mean by this integrative and precise analytical mind. He was very kind to patients and residents. He was fierce. He could be ferocious and scare the life out of you. You know, he was gentle. He was hard as granite, soft as a cloud. What allegedly Sandberg said about Lincoln. He knew, when Winnicott said, how to be with and how to let be. So how are you with a person and find that right existential distance so that you feel like you have a presence when you need it, but you can sort of let the person be and leave them alone so they can do what they need to do. He was outstanding, forming a therapeutic alliance, surviving collisions. He was a wonderful teacher, mentor, and friend. Bob said, in a little note he sent us, which was very sweet, he said, could you give 3 take-home messages? And, oh, God, I can't. I've got 20, but I limited it to 6. And I'll sort of illustrate a few of these. So one is this, I've already mentioned to you, that this interviewing, he described as, how do you connect? And we'll talk about that in a minute. Well, maybe I'll go into it a little bit right here. And so how to form a therapeutic alliance. There's a story about this. At one point, when I was a clinical director at McLean, I'd have lunch with Les at the Harvard Faculty Club pretty regularly. And he said, hey, let's do this Saturday morning series. I'm going to tell people what psychotherapy is about. You're going to be kind of like an intermediate. So I was thinking to myself, you're kind of like when the wolves became dogs, you know, or somehow we're going to transition something from his mind into the rest of us. And the idea was that he would give this talk, and then I'd kind of listen and kind of say what I thought, how it resonated maybe with clinical work, and then the people like you who are going to it would kind of sort of engage. And I thought the whole thing was going great. And Susan came up to me maybe after the 4th or 5th of these and says, do you guys think they're getting it? And I said, what do you mean? They love it. You know, and she said, you two get each other, but are they getting it? I know you two. You know, so I thought about it, I thought, oh, maybe she's a little envious. I don't know. Maybe, you know, I'm hanging out with her husband too much, you know. And I thought, but then I thought about it a little more, and I thought, no, you know, what if that's true? So I said to Les, you know, I didn't tell him what she said, but I said to Les, you know, you're one of the best people I've ever met at forming a therapeutic relationship. In this book you wrote, he was really proud at that time, it was just a few years after he had written Making Contact, The Uses of Language in Psychotherapy, which is an extraordinary book, but it's really deep. It's like when you read a good poet, or it's sort of like Winnicott writes that way, where you read something, you read it again, and you read it again, and it starts sinking in. So I said, that's a lot of work, it's really cool, but could you write a little bit simpler version of that? And he said, no, 2 cookbook. You can't write something like that, 2 cookbook, you know, and I maybe brought it up a while later. And then finally, after I had left the Boston area and I moved out to the Berkshires in maybe 1994, probably about 4 years after that, a manuscript arrives in the mail, and it says, here it is, I finally did it, you know, that kind of, I finally did it, you know, see what you think, you're the godfather, you know, and this is this little message, and it's this paper, and I put it on the list that I handed out that I really would recommend you play with, and it's called The Best Kept Secret. How to Form a Therapeutic Alliance, but he added a second piece to that. He said that once you flow back and forth, that the second part of that is that you're going to collide with each other. No 2 human beings can't do it. So you can use this paper. If you don't want to do it clinically, use it with your spouse. Use it with your partners. Use it with your kids. I practice it on the elevator. I go to D.C. or some town, and I say, I wonder how I can find this person in just a few minutes. I got about a minute and a half on this elevator. I wonder what I can find out and how we'll connect. And I use the stuff that's right in there. Now, the second part that he added to that, which was really interesting, and we hadn't talked about this, he said, you will collide, and there'll always be a moment when your perspective encounters the other perspective in a way that's fresh. But instead, we say things like, what? You're crazy, or what? That doesn't make, so there's this kind of like sense of, wow, and if you don't think of it clinically, just think about what happens in a house with anybody that you live with. Those moments, what? Why did she do that? Or why? Who would have thought, you have these feelings. And he said, can you just hold on for a minute when you feel that? And then really make an empathic effort to see the world from that person's point of view and see where the common ground is. So that's what that paper's all about. And we use it in our residency training program. On the very first day of residency, we play with it with each other. And we look at that, and that can be used. One of my residents, who's now Williams College mental health medical director of their mental health, when she trained with us, she said when she went into her PGY3 year. So the PGY3 is when you kind of leave the sort of hovering support of inpatient psychiatrists, and you have people all around who can help you out when things get scary. Now you're in the outpatient setting, and you feel a lot alone, but you also feel kind of cool because you're now somebody that people really feel, this is my doctor, and there's not a bunch of other people telling them what to do. But she said whenever she got lost, she'd go back to this flow of forming the therapeutic alliance. And she'd say, I would be lost. I didn't know what I was doing. My patients, I was afraid, were thinking I was really stupid and an imposter. And I'd start doing that. And just like that, they thought I was really good at what I was doing, and I find them again. So there's something cool there, and I recommend that. And maybe I'll show you that flow in a moment. Okay. So the other thing, be playful and curious. He really taught us how to enjoy and have skill at discovering what Bob mentioned, the person in the patient. And at the end, we'll have Susan read us a little bit from the end of a group. We put together a team effort of a number of writers and people that we worked with shared our common interest in existential psychiatry and a relational approach to therapy, psychiatric work. And in that, he talks about the person and the patient. Let's say Dickens' A Christmas Carol, there's a sweet passage where he says, Christmas is like a time of year when people realize we're not just like isolated, angry people in a city in Dickens' London, but we're all fellow passengers to the grave. And in some way, Les's existential psychiatry is this acknowledgement that just as powerful as biologic descriptive psychiatry or interpersonal field psychiatry or psychodynamic developmental psychiatry is this sense that we're all born and we're all going to die, and that we're on this road together. And that this feeling of isolation that we all experience in different ways at different times is so profound that if someone can learn how to find the right distance from another and find that person, that's as powerful as, lithium carbonate and Seroquel or ECT or, anything we can do. Even the deep brain stimulation of Helen Mayberg as she goes into the Brodmann's area 25 and puts the insular cortex back on track in a severe depression by pushing a button on an electrode. This connecting is as powerful as anything we know, and it's one of the things we all can do, and that was something he taught us a lot about. Now, this be bold, figure out what works, create the new. That's what the conference is about today. And I've shared this in other contexts and many of the people who trained with Leston. And I'd be curious, on the first day of training, so you come in as a resident after all this life hard work that you've done, to get finally to be able to become a psychiatrist. You've gone through your pre-med and your med studies, your medical school studies, and your internship, which, you know, is a tough year of your life, your PG-11. And then you're about to start the new thing, your professional identity. You're going to get a horizontal identity. You're going to connect now to, you have your vertical identity from your family and your ancestors and your language and your religion, but now you're going to connect laterally into this powerful horizontal identity that's going to give you balance and help you do what you wanted to do. But what he said was, we sat us down, and I'd be curious if a listener remembers it the same way, but I think what I remember is that he said to us, the first thing I need you to do is to lie to your supervisors. Do you remember it that way? Yeah, okay. So Alyssa remembers that. So she was my buddy in this adventure. And the feeling was, it would make you laugh, and then all of a sudden it would make you afraid. Because you'll laugh and you say, wait a minute, like, you know, what's this? Is this a trick? Am I supposed to say, no, I'd never lie to a supervisor. I'm Honest Abe, or are the supervisors that bad that we better lie to them? Or, so he had the ability to kind of make you laugh. So he moved your body with a sudden unexpected. And there was a whole lot behind it, and then you wonder about it. And then he followed it. I mean, he gave us a little narrative descriptor, but even when he gave me narrative descriptors, there's tons of things that happened between him and me that I could never really tell. Did we really reach the narrative agreement, the mutual agreement on the words? Or was he still kind of working me in a little way, in some way that he thought would be best done indirectly? And so at a limbic level, at a kind of deep intuitive level, that was fun. I mean, that was a game, at least for me, it was very playful. But what he said was, if you don't lie to your supervisors, the field will never advance. Because the field won't advance because they know what they know. And maybe even if some of them, maybe 60 or 70% of it's right, 30 or 40% of it's wrong. And if you imitate them like little monkeys in a show, the patients are going to suffer. And this is not the Girl Scouts or the Boy Scouts. People's lives are at stake. Are you ready for this? Something like that would be, he'd kind of be playful, and then he'd get into this, fire and brimstone sermon type thing. And so this was kind of cool, but it's kind of the tradition here of us working with the new people coming into the field. Some of us who've been here a long time, having some fun, sharing, processing what we've learned. And I love that, to see like the medical students or the residents, after they watch one of these tapes, I'll say, all right, what are you going to try this week? And they might take out like a little sentence, and I'm going to try this. And there could be nothing more perfect than seeing something that caught their imagination. And I say, yeah, go on. Do you think it'll work? I don't know. I'm kind of scared. Or I don't know, maybe. And I said, well, go try it. To hope you don't kill the patient, but go try it out and see what happens. And there's this kind of curiosity about the work that occurs. The Four Schools of Psychiatry, another take-home message. So a very beautiful book is this one, Approaches to the Mind, Movement of the Psychiatric Schools from Sects, like religious sects, towards science, okay? And written in, I think, 1973 or 1976. And in that book, you could read the whole thing, and it's beautiful, and it's an early effort to create a framework for complexity that's really, it fits today as well as it did back then. So it stands the test of time. Now, what we do with that, we sort of made a modification, and Krishni's doing this with her new students in her class. And she did this with the medical students from the 3 medical students. We have a little game that we play called Cinematic Experience and the 4 schools of psychiatry. Cinematic experience and the 4 schools of psychiatry. And in that cinematic experience, what we do is we just have a little paragraph, or maybe a sentence or 2 that describes the different perspective and the way of understanding with that school. And then we show clips. Everybody, maybe I'll do it, the associate program director will do it. We'll show it, a few clips from a movie, and we say, what just happened there with these people? And then they get to play with which school or which schools, which approach kind of explains that, what they just saw best. And just after 1 or 2 primings like that, they go wild with it. They can't wait to take charge, and they get the movie they want, and they bring them in. And we've had all kinds of wonderful experiences. They don't want the class to end. We do about 10 of those, maybe for about 10 weeks. And it's just a playful engagement of this conceptual framework, but it's so alive, okay? So that's the 4th take-home message. 5th, courage and skills in engaging the suicidal patient. Courage and skills. So both things. And a little bit later, I'm going to have Ben read a passage from one of Les's famous essays that's in the book, A Safe Place, which if you're new to his work, that might be, I would say if you're new to his work, read that interviewing thing first, The Best Kept Secret. This is a little, 5 or 6 page article, but it's an eternal thing. It's so good. And then maybe go to A Safe Place, because it's kind of like a novel, and it integrates in like a beautiful novel writer with the ability to capture human experience using these 4 threads of perspective and brings the people alive. He used to say to me, I said, how do you do that? And he'd say, well, before I would write those, I would imagine the person. And I imagine the person and call them up to mind and feel them. And then I would write those passages. So there are different chapters on different situations and different people that he tried to help. But he would call them to life. I was trying to do that the night before we came here. I had a million things. I'd been at a different conference the night before, and I was kind of tired. But I woke up about 2 in the morning. I went down and sat in comfortable seated position, sukhasana, and meditated in my sunroom. And then I put on a little tape that I'm going to just play you a moment of, just to hear Les's voice. But I sort of called him to mind, and I was doing what he told me he did when he was trying to write A Safe Place, what he was thinking of. Courage and skills. Respecting and learning from the psychotic patient and fostering the development of emerging self. I mean, that's putting it into a different language. He wouldn't even probably say, the essay that, and it's lecture 55, you really should listen to that, and it'll explain everything by demonstration. When you listen to Les talk and think, you'll see the way he would pull everything together in this very vital, lively way. But in that, he's talking about a woman who, since she was 4 years old, she's now a young adult woman, but she's probably had anorexia at times, some kind of psychotic illness, very disconnected from the world. Here's the way he described it, though. This is what's so beautiful. He wouldn't use the word psychotic. Later on, at the very end of the lecture, he said, well, some people probably would have called her psychotic or that. But the whole hour of his talking about this kind of thing that he would do where he'd pull in Nietzsche, and he'd be wondering about the fall of the communist empire, and he'd be thinking about the existential questions of a world without faith in God, and who's going to Where's the rules? Where are they going to come from? And then he'd talk about neuroscience all of a sudden and the thalamus. This could be happening because the thalamus is sort of like a gating center. In your brain, it's sort of like O'Hare Airport. Sensory information comes in, goes to O'Hare, called the thalamus, gets routed out to different parts of association cortex, pulled together, and then you think you know something, all right? And he said, I think this may be happening in her thalamus. There's kind of like an opaque one. It's getting a little bit clearer, but she needs a better thalamus. Too much is coming in. And yet when she's inside, she feels empty, and outside this window to the world that's clouded, she feels like she's an imposter when she tries to put herself into the world of others. This is a real predicament. But could it be, he asks, do I just deceive myself? And is she actually the one who really knows what's going on here and is acknowledging it more clearly? But because she doesn't have the capacity for self-deception, we think she's psychotic, and we are. I mean, he doesn't say it quite like that. But when you read it, I mean, when you listen to it, you'll hear that. So those things would be my 6. Okay, and I have a much more complicated set of slides and this and that. But what we want to do is just take a minute, and I'm going to see if I can just pull his voice into the room first. And this is coming from that essay or that lecture. So let me just see if I can do this. Hold on for 1 second.
Persuade her or a hospital to do something about it, though that was not the only thing that brought her to the hospital. But it occurred to me in the course of what little I understood that was the wrong idea. And that was once again an imposition of correctness on this perspective grid. And I thought that I told her I thought she should not eat, really, until we could find a way.
This is one of the things I loved about him. So he's got an anorectic woman. They're trying to force feed, and he's the therapist. And so he talks in this very professorial way, like a, I don't know how you describe that, what he just did. But, I'm just thinking, this isn't the right idea. They're trying to force feed her. So I told her, I don't think you should eat. I don't think you should eat till you're ready to eat. And then they hear them. The spies would hear, Havens is disrupting another treatment. Fire the therapist. He's not at one with the treatment team. This guy is probably like Paul Revere riding around. He would have fought the redcoats. Get him out of here. So this is what he would do. It was crazy and fun and wonderful. And part of what he goes on to say in this is you have to actually enter this chaotic, psychotic stew and feel okay in there, and maybe even be crazier than the patient, because when you actually go there and explore that, they correct you and kind of tune you up, and then you trade, you dance together, and maybe sometimes neither of you are in that world, So it's a beautiful dance, but just listen to him. And
way to eat for herself rather than for them. That we wanted to make a life in which it was worth being fed, as opposed to being force-fed. And whether because I said it with as much feeling as I had, or whether it was the right thing to say, or I think what's more likely, whether something had been happening in our relationship which gave me an authority that made possible the collapse of this prior authority, so that what I said had a meaning was substituted in that perspective, which I think is what happened. And you've probably forgotten, but at the time I discussed this once before, I mentioned that was not at the same time, but sufficiently close in time to the extraordinary collapse of the communist regimes of Eastern Europe, And people were speculating how that was possible. And it was common to read in the newspapers and to hear spoken the statement that, well, you know, when the people lose faith in the regime immediately collapses. That in fact the regime is the people, selected parts of the people. And that when those people cannot be believed anymore, it collapses. And that, I found that a surprising idea, and I still find it partly very, very difficult, because I am faced by a machine gun wielded by the boss. The importance of my faith in the regime seems to me trivial. But anyway, that's a viewpoint that was commonly said. And I thought to myself, well, maybe there's something to it. That maybe this it was quite rapid, the collapse of her God perspective. Maybe it had something to do with a shift in her loyalty, be that as it may. Now, when that perspective...
So I would urge you, that thing, I would like to play, it's an hour and 6 minutes or something like that. I wanted to play 20 minutes of it because it would illustrate everything I'm telling you comes to life in that. Okay, but you just hear it, and you hear Les's voice, and that's what I meant about, he just brings in history like it's a buddy with us, with the patient. We're all in the room, just alive, as if people from our imagination sort of are alive. Sometimes when I go into the deeper dreams and I sort of get below the kind of personal unconscious, to what Jung called the archetypal unconscious or the collective unconscious. Jung had described it as numinosity. So when you find your way in that place, the dream characters actually feel like real people. I mean, you might say Sabo's psychotic, and maybe it's so. But when you get to that space, I can remember characters who showed up in dreams when I lived over on Line Street in Somerville, and I was at Cambridge Hospital, or after I graduated from college. And I can remember characters who came that were the classic trickster figures that are all throughout any Native American culture and all kinds of other cultures, and they come alive. And somehow Les had an imagination where I was asleep when that stuff happened to me, but he was like in the room, and they all come alive and are there ready to play their part in a great play. It's just beautiful the way that happens. So those are some of my memories and things I wanted to share. What I wanted to do now was ask a few people here, and I'm going to ask Ben Sandow, who's Les's youngest grandson, to come up and just read a passage. And I'll introduce the passage. It's the final passage from Anatomy of a Suicide. And it's a beautiful and tragic story of a woman as her children have left and she's feeling more isolated and in sort of early old age or late middle age, and the forces that came and contributed to her death. And in that, Les really explores all the possibilities. But at the end, he talks about the kinds of energies that people have to manage who try to help other people who are at risk of suicide. And there's tons of that, always has been, always will be, and is going on right now in greater degrees than in the past, right now. And one of those energies is the ability to manage your fear, to be close enough to the person who's at risk to be able to sit with fear and figure out what to do with that. And so I'm going to just ask Ben to come on up and just read that passage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. And thank you, Alex, for this genuinely wonderful, I think, introduction to Leston's life and works. Just want to say as well that as you become, one of the things I've remarked is as you grow up and you become an adult able to intellectually engage with your family members around you, there are some whom you have to do posthumously and there are others you can do in person. And Leston is one of the former, and Jenny is one of the Jenny is the latter. So this is from the essay. The anger that our patient secretly carried may have been just as secretly present in our clinical decisions. The contagious quality of feelings is readily observable. We speak of one person as stimulating, another as depressing, one acquaintance as exciting, and another we find ourselves eternally arguing with. Such reactions are not solely or even largely the result of what the other person says. Manner, attitude, appearance, the faithful servants of feeling, give their tone not only to social life, but to the clinic and consulting room as well. Anger is extremely contagious, perhaps especially when indirect and semi-secret. In short, were we reacting to her unspoken anger by becoming angry ourselves? This is the way with paradoxically quiet situations. The charge is buried, and one must look hard for the marks of its existence. And the search must not be only into patients, but into ourselves. There is an old story that very nearly sums up this discussion of suicide. It is a story about generalship and war, and therefore appropriate to these remarks about treatment and death. It suggests a comparison between the general and the doctor, springing from the amount of pain and fear each has to bear. The French Marshal Turenne, watching his army thrown back in near defeat, was approached by an aide-de-camp who wanted to flee before retreat was impossible. The general was standing very still, and his aide-de-camp asked, "Are you not afraid?" The great Turenne, Napoleon's military idol, replied, "If you were as afraid as I am, you would run away." Here is the challenge of suicide: to stay with the battle and feel, and not to run from what must be borne. That's it.
So you get the feel of how Les does this, both in his writing, and he totally embodied that in his interactions with the people he helped, the residents he taught, the patients he helped, all those he reached. The second piece I wanted to kind of, we'll have Susan read, and then I'll just share one last message. But this one comes from the Real World Guide to Psychotherapy Practice, where we wanted to advocate for a relational approach to practice, and that was where the great hope was. And Tanya Luhrmann was she was the daughter of a psychiatrist, and she was writing at the time. She was studying residence at UC San Diego, at McLean, Cambridge, and she was trying to get at the growing disorder in American psychiatry and kind of the splitting of the soul of psychiatry. So we sent the book over to her because we knew she'd really like it, and she wrote a nice thing for us on the back of it that this would be a very important book, and because it was talking about the importance of relationship, this finding the person and the patient. And at the end of when we put it all together with our colleagues and wrote some parts ourselves, I wanted the last, this was going to probably be the last kind of thing I did with them, that in that way, like a writing of something, I wanted that epilogue to be Vintage Havens. And for some reason, he sent it to me, and he stopped 2 paragraphs before the end. And he sent this to me, and I was like, what? This is like he stopped sort of on the biologic descriptive analogy that he had been working on years later. And I said, this isn't finished. Take it back and finish it. And then he added these 2 paragraphs, which really heightened the theme of this conference. One of the major themes of what he was trying to do, and the whole idea of these William James lectures, where the humanistic psychology is so important to the survival of what we're trying to do. And maybe I have a context I'm just going to put here. This is the call to arms of why, this is the context in which Susan's reading is. Let this wash over you in this context. I have suggested that what we mean by civilization is largely our replacement of cannibalism and physical enslavement by their psychological equivalents. That is to say, genuine human respect, giving others their freedom, the capacity to protect one's own freedom and self. All these are rare. Predation and slavery continue among us in the sense of psychological invasiveness and compliance. I believe that psychiatry, and I would say psychotherapy, broaden it to all the people who are trying to help other people in this way, has a great role to play in defining the conditions of human self-respect and freedom, as well as in helping individuals achieve this in their own lives. And so I want to just ask Susan to read those last couple paragraphs from one attempt to summarize these efforts.
Well, Les would be so thrilled to see the young people here and the people who have not heard the comments before or read his work. He'd be happy to see the rest of you, but he probably wouldn't pay a lot of attention to you. And he'd ask why were we here being so sentimental when there's work to do. Now, this is something that Alex and Les did pull off that's really, really for the world, and the Real World Guide to Psychotherapy. It's a wonderful title. Thank you, Alex. Okay, so this is the epilogue that Les came up with at the end. Meanwhile, we search for the person in the patient because that person is our ally in the work to be done. We begin to recognize that person, by his or her interests, talents, ambitions, values, and common humanness. This last we do not much identifying with, the capacities to love and hate, fear and hope, join and separate, the infinite variations on the common ground. It's our sympathy with and confidence in this person that underpins our support of the work, just as the surgeon decides that the patient's strength of heart and lungs is what makes possible the surgery. Many times, the therapist, like the surgeon, must take responsibility for the outcome because a despairing patient cannot believe there is a different future to be gained. Therapists can carry the hope in such alliances until the patient sees what may result. Hence, the alliance is a kind of believing in and hoping for by workers who sense the real person in the patient. An earlier generation will protest this suggestion. Long a forbidden activity, taking the work away from the central task of exploration. Yet it is not suggestion so much as recognition by the sensible acknowledgement of the person whom the therapist may in fact have found. The goal of this relationship, then, is not only the excavation of the past, it is as much the construction of a future that can be believed in. This involves the identification not only of syndromes and complexes, but also of interests and values of the person in the patient. As a result, therapists have someone to ally with. What is more, by the construction of the patient's future, therapists gain new elements in their own futures. for what the patient accomplished becomes, in some measure, part of the history of the therapist. All of us who have long done this work can look back at those happy times when the patient's gain has also been, in part, our own. Thereby, an extraordinary joy enters the work for both parties through this making of our lives. Can there be better work to do in the world?
So I'm just going to end with this. This kind of sums it up. When two people meet, an initial interview is essentially a delightful stew in which the unconscious minds of two people intertwine and stir about in the mysterious nuances of each other's shadows. Both minds will be forever changed. There's no other way.
So wonderful to be here. Thank you, Bob, for putting together this amazing tribute to Les's work. And another Bob in the room. Thank you, Bob Michaels, my first chair at Cornell when I did my adult residency, for coming up from New York to be with us. In honor of Les, I am not using slides. Those of you who used to see him talk. Sorry, Alex. I was not a student or trainee of Les in any formal sense of the word. I'm his daughter. Certainly, that only deepened the impact. In retrospect, probably psychiatry was more or less inevitable for me. As a child, I remember him always seriously buried in something, a book or papers he was working on in that illegible longhand of his. He published Approaches to the Mind in 1973, the year before I graduated from high school. Our family life was reconfiguring during that time that he was writing that book, and in that stressful and exciting period, he was laying the foundation of his work for years to come, defining the conceptualizations and techniques of the sex of the schools of psychiatry, so that you could almost hold each one of them up in your hand and examine all the sides of them and pick out what was useful. As he said in A Safe Place, unless things can be seen from a different perspective, they cannot be seen at all. It was a rigorous, deep, and open-minded review with the clear goal of articulating the approaches of each school and defining what they had to offer to us. And these approaches always involved the use of language, perception, and the stance of the therapist. No one school was better than the other. All had their utilities and their fairly typical use or non-use of language. He, of course, argued for a judicious and fluid blend. This was the first book I ever read about psychiatry. I went on to read the rest as he produced them one after another, as well as his many journal articles. Before going to medical school, I watched his miraculous, eye-opening interviews with the patients no one else could find at Mass Mental. I saw a couple of them, phenomenal. In residency and thereafter, I watched his equally astonishing grand rounds talks in New York, where he would speak extemporaneously, or so it seemed, for 45 minutes and blow people's minds, particularly the young people, who so hungered for the humanity of his approach. The things I learned from him were my foundation in psychiatry. It is a young field, quoting from Safe Place, it is like an adolescent, disputatious, alternately arrogant and humble, strong, full of promise, inconsistent, able to see what others can't see, even preoccupied with sex. It was on thin ice, and I quote, the whole field is in the untenable position of attempting to define sickness before it has defined health, and it often lost its way, particularly when stuck in a secular rut. There was a clear job to do, not an easy job, but the core of it all. Find the person and bring them back to themselves. His was a dramatic and dark worldview, characterized by domination and destruction, Treatment was going into battle in the civil wars raging within the person, working very hard to stay alongside and not to be taken in by the fighting forces. The treatment followed a particular definable course: locate and engage the person, widen and balance and clear the battlefield so, and I quote, the scattered elements can be approximated when they lie apart or separated when they have been condensed. That's from Making Contact. Build up the elements of the real self you together find within. And it had to be safe for any of this to happen. This was not something I was taught in my psychiatry training. Sorry, Bob. In Les's words, quote, what enables the locations of another's existence, a knowledge of the possibility of human existence, is never systematically presented. Les published 6 books between 1973 and 1994. I completed my various psychiatric residencies and fellowships in 1991. I had the best possible guide alongside me as I wandered through the waning years of psychoanalytic tradition into the waxing years, still waxing, of biological psychiatry. I saw them for what they were: approaches with their strengths and weaknesses, their apostles and their critics, but only approaches, which should be utilized for their helpfulness and ignored for their oversimplification and dogma. They were both useful and flawed, and almost impossible to synthesize. One had to work in parallel. The tolerance for ambiguity and tension was a basic assumption of much of what I read and heard from Les: credulity and skepticism alongside each other, and humility, a great deal of humility. Of course, when you become a child psychiatrist, the world changes. Les always told me, particularly after I became one, that child psychiatrists were the smartest of us all. And why? Instead of wading through the adult mind and memory and affect to recreate what happened to shatter the person, another quote, the goal is to see what you would have been had you been there. That's from Safe Place. You are actually in the middle of everything happening right in front of you. The themes of domination and cruelty and reality twisted into fiction are everywhere. You don't have to dig for them, you just have to see them. And you have to be prepared to go to battle, but carefully, very carefully. Those waging the wars so desperately need each other to survive, and most of the time, all need to be protected. Sometimes hope is all we have, and in the most difficult cases, we have to dig for even that. But it all comes back to people sitting together in a room, sometimes 2, sometimes more for those brave souls who do the all-important family work. Reaching the other only starts the work. Les taught us that. The real work follows, and it is not for the faint of heart, he warned us. I think Alex Leap used that line too. He was always saying that. He titled his last 2 books, Coming to Life and Learning to be Human. I believe this is his magic. His ability to articulate, and actually I always found reading Les was similar to reading the early writings of Freud. He was able to articulate what wavers on the edge of awareness in the real interface of human connection, including in our work, the emergence of the real self. And he articulated the tools to do the job. He told us what to say and how to say it and when to say it in the course of the shifting positions we must take as we move through treatment. That was and remains the most useful thing of all. Les gave me that, he gave us all that. And thanks to the work of Susan, his wife, who I'm quoting again, gave him the gift of the real. It is available to the next generations struggling to figure it out. Thank you, Susan, for that heartfelt, enormous piece of work. I don't see myself see patients much anymore, as I've taken the path of fighting for patients on a systems level, where, by the way, all of Les's teachings are highly applicable. His quote from George Bernard Shaw, if you're going to tell them the truth, you better make them laugh or they'll kill you. And what I think is an original Lesism, the trouble isn't that people are paranoid, it's that they're not paranoid enough. These ideas have helped me enormously in institutional life, where, by the way, he advised me, you must always keep one foot out the door. But from time to time, I'm called to see a patient, a young person usually, very troubled, stuck in a hospital, at wit's end, and most commonly drugged to the gills. Les is looking over my shoulder, making those little noises of appreciation as I locate that young person and bring them to life in front of their treatment team. I learned that from him. Thank you.